Hello, good evening, my children of night. Welcome to Vampire Book Club. How's my sound? Please let me know if you can hear me. As you can see, I am in a different setup. I'm actually at my grandma's old house. So I'm not sure if I sound good. I'm sorry the background isn't spooky. It's very grandma. But look at these cool old books. Do you see that? This is a full set of the entire Victor Hugo collection that's like over 100 years old. You see all these books? There's more up here. Can you see them? Like some grandma stuff. Thank you. All right. Glad the sound's good. So, Vampire Book Club, welcome. This month we read Dracul by Dacre Stoker and J.D. Barker. And thank you to everyone on Discord who's part of the book club who read it with me, because this is a big book. It's a book that I've had for more than a year. I got it for Christmas. Paul gave it to me for Christmas, not this past Christmas, but the Christmas before. And it's been sitting on my shelf, and I never read it just because, it was a commitment and I didn't get around to it. And the whole reason I started Vampire Book Club is to have people to encourage me to read all the vampire books that I never actually read myself. So thank you, you people. You're doing it for me. So how many people here read it? Just let me know. If you didn't read it, that's okay. I'm going to tell you all about it. Tonight, I'm drinking Angry Orchard because that is what we have here at Grandma's house. So I am actually in my grandma's old house, which Grandma died about 10 years ago. And we had a tenant living in this house, and we just found out that the tenant wasn't taking care of the house at all. So we had to come evict the tenant and take over the house on complete sudden notice. I just found out about this like 4 days ago, and then I had to come up here, 13-hour drive. So what I did was I listened to the Dracul audiobook on my 13-hour drive on my way up here, because I didn't have time to actually read it because I was driving and cleaning and doing everything that I need to do for Grandma's house. And I listened to the audiobook. I did read some of it like in between. So I kind of read the first chunk and then I read the last chunk, but I listened mostly to the audiobook in the middle. And as an audiobook, I really liked it. I don't listen to audiobooks that often, but as far as audiobook quality goes, it was a good one. All right, I am having sound issues, so I'm going to fix my sound a little bit and see if I can. What if I just move the microphone back? Tell me if that makes it sound better. Otherwise, I can try gaining it down. Or I can just speak a little more quietly. Tell me if that sounds better, if I'm too quiet now. If I'm too loud. So the audiobook had a full cast. This Dracul is done in an epistolary format similar to Dracula. What Dracul is it's sort of a prequel to Dracula. And it sets itself up as supposedly an accurate prequel that Bram Stoker never told us. And it's been like found footage, kind of the way that Dracula's epistolary format is a found footage book. This is a found footage book as well. So we got journal entries, diary entries, letters, interspersed with just narrative passages that are in present tense. And I think the reason those passages were in present tense in the sections they were was because the author wanted you to be like, oh, what if they're going to die? And have some suspense there, because if it was a diary entry or a letter, we would know that they didn't die because they're telling us about it in past tense. So, right. Oh, yes, there's one telegram. All right, sounds fine. All right. I'm sorry the sound is not the best quality, but if it's workable, we'll just deal with it. So, if you haven't read Dracula, this book will not mean much to you. You really kind of have to have read Dracula, or at least have a fairly good knowledge of the original Dracula to truly appreciate this book. If you don't, it just reads as kind of like a generic vampire book. And as a generic vampire book without all the connections to Dracula and Bram Stoker himself, it is so generic. Excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat. Need some cider. excuse me. This house is very dusty. As I said, we had a tenant who didn't take care of it at all. And so I'm like coughing because of dust right now. Pardon me. I apologize. I might have to go get some water because cider is good, but I'm not sure that it's helping the tickle in my throat. So as a generic vampire novel, it was kind of too generic for me because the way Dracula was written, vampire tropes weren't a thing back when it was written. It started the vampire tropes. And when people were reading Dracula, they're like, what is this mysterious man? Who's this mysterious creature? What is he going to turn out to be? They didn't know. They couldn't just guess vampire. And then it was a surprise. So if you're reading this, you're like, oh, I can tell it's a vampire. I know vampire tropes. I know that because she's cold to the touch and only comes out at night. Of course she's a vampire. There's no suspense. There's no surprise. So it works much better as a supplement to Dracula itself. Excuse me. I'm going to go get some water. I will be right back. Talk amongst yourselves. Tell me, did you read the book? I want to see yes or no's in the chat so I can know how many people actually read it. And if you've read Dracula with it, or if you read it without having read Dracula. So let me know that. I will be right back. Oh, you heard this book was crappy? You know, there's another book by Dacre Stoker that was written in combination with a different author, and that one has a much worse reputation than this book. This book is the one that's supposedly the good one compared to the other one. Interesting. So a bit of background on how this book was written. Dacre Stoker is not an author. He is the descendant of Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker is like his great uncle. And he is the manager of the Stoker estate. The Stoker estate is managed. They don't own the rights to Dracula because it's public domain, but they do have other ways of, you know, managing Dracula estate and having it be part of their family legacy. He has a lot of documents about the family that are interest to scholars. He has a lot of research. He has a Dracula merchandise store that's the official merchandise. And he was approached by an author who had written a sequel to Dracula, which you can do. Anyone can write a sequel to Dracula and publish it. It is legal because it's public domain. And this author had written this sequel to Dracula and had no luck getting it published. So this author approaches Dacre Stoker and says, hey, would you help me work on this sequel to Dracula, maybe fix it up a bit, get it into better shape, and maybe with us together, with your name, I can get this published. And so Dacre lent his expertise and his knowledge to that sequel and added bits to it. Didn't do any writing. He did the research, he did the study, he did all that stuff and put his name on it. And that book's called Dracula the Undead. And that was the first book that he contributed to. That was a fiction book. And it was released as the official sequel to Dracula, not just a fanfic sequel to Dracula, because he could do that because he owns the Stoker legacy with his family. So Dracula the Undead came out and it did not do very well. The author who he worked with is not very good, in my opinion. I didn't like the writing style. I didn't like the ideas of the book. And then a different author approached Dacre Stoker years later and said, would you like to work together with me on a book? And that was Dracul. And this is a book about Bram Stoker's life himself. So Dacre Stoker was able to apply much more of his family legacy knowledge to it, have a much more active part in writing the book. And that's J.D. Barker. So J.D. Barker did the writing. Dacre Stoker gave him the information to write about. And this book just came out a couple of years ago and was much more of a success as the unofficial prequel to Dracula, with the idea that Dracula is a true story. Because according to this book, the original preface to Dracula started out like Fargo saying, you're about to watch a true story, even though obviously it's not, because vampires aren't real. But Bram Stoker wanted to publish it as if to say, this is a true story. These are true documents. These are true journal entries. Van Helsing is a real scientist. I changed the names to protect their identities, but everything in this book is true. And his publisher was like, no, Jack the Ripper exists. People are unhappy. We can't pretend it's a true story. So they cut that part out of the prologue of the original Dracula. But it's still there in other drafts that these researchers have access to. So the premise of this book is like, what if it was a true story? What if it was part of Bram Stoker's life? What if he was involved? And how did he get to the point where he became the person to write the book about Dracula? So it all starts when he was born. He has been involved with Dracula his whole life, according to this book. So this book features his family. He had a lot of siblings. They were Irish Catholic. So, you know, the stereotype of having a lot of children was very true with his family. And they had a family nanny. And two of his siblings, Matilda and Thornley, feature mostly in this book. And what happens is right before Bram was born, when his mom was pregnant with him, they got a new family nanny who showed up on their doorstep and became their nanny. And then Bram was a very sickly child. He just had this wasting illness until he was 7 years old. And then he kind of had this miraculous recovery and was a normal child and grew up into a normal man after that. Normal meaning healthy, not wasting away. So the premise of this book is, what if that nanny was a vampire? And the reason he got miraculously better at the age of 7 was because she gave him some vampire blood that saved his life. And that made him thereby get all tangled up with vampires for the rest of his life, with his sister, who's like wants to be an amateur sleuth apparently, and then his brother winds up getting brought into it too because he has connections. So the first section of the book, it's done in 3 parts. So this much of it is when they're children, and then the rest of it's like the adventure, and then this is like the climax. So the first part of the book is when Bram and his sister Matilda are children. They're trying to figure out what's up with the nanny. Of course, everyone reading this book knows the nanny's a vampire, so the mystery isn't that great for us, but it's written well enough that it's still engaging. And yes, the nanny was real. Ellen Crone was real. I don't know if she was anything like the Ellen in this book, but she was really their nanny. And what made it interesting, besides just being a generic vampire tale, which would have no suspense for us, is the way the vampire is portrayed. It had a very gothic ambiance, a very spooky setting. The writing style is very gothic. If you like gothic literature with all its like spooky tropes, spooky castles, spooky houses, fog, mist, bats, ambiance, it was just written like that. It was delicious and gorgeous and everything you would want with children like investigating vampire shenanigans. And it ends, that part ends when, right after she cures Bram, and then she mysteriously disappears. She just leaves their life. So then it jumps ahead 20 years, not 20 years, 14 years or something like that. So Bram's now 21 years old. And he's kind of gotten over it. He has forgotten about it. But his sister is still obsessed. She's like still trying to solve the mystery of this nanny. She thinks she saw the nanny in Paris one day. So she goes to Bram and she's like, I saw her after all this time. She's still out there and she hasn't aged a day. And Bram's like, pshaw, forget about it. It's not real. But she starts showing him proof. And so he starts believing it. And then you find out later that he did know it was real and he was seeing her himself the whole time and he was lying about it. So they go to their brother Thornley to ask for help in kind of solving this mystery. And he turns out that he's seen the nanny as well as this other man who was their neighbor who died tragically. His whole family was slaughtered and he got accused of the crime, but obviously it was vampires who did it. And they saw him back to life too. And that's kind of what instigates this, is they saw him come back to life and then he died again. But he hadn't aged a day. So they go to the brother. And meanwhile, we find out the brother's wife, Emily, has been suffering from madness. She's doing like a Renfield thing where she's kind of slowly losing. And clearly she's being preyed upon by a vampire. It's very much the same as Lucy in Dracula, Emily's situation. So Thornley, who's a medical doctor, agrees to try to help them. They want to go see the body of the guy who seemed to come back to life, who hadn't aged a day, in the morgue. So he sneaks them into the hospital, into the morgue. They find him. He's already been autopsied. All his organs are out of his body. It's very macabre. It's very spooky. But then the heart that's in the dish next to the autopsy tables beats. And the sister Matilda freaks out, and they're like, oh no, you didn't see it. It wasn't real. But, of course, the reader knows it's real. Very spooky. Very well done. And then they decide to go dig up the grave of this guy to see, well, if he was really buried 14 years ago, he'll be in his grave. This is Patrick O'Keefe. Maybe this guy just looks exactly like him, has the same exact scars as him, and everything could be coincidence. So they go to dig up Patrick O'Keefe's grave. And inside the grave, they find no body. They find a bunch of rocks like aligned in the shape of a body. And they find a bunch of the nanny's stuff. So the nanny's like mirror, some jewelry, a hairbrush, and letters, a diary. They find the nanny's diary, and it's written in Hungarian. And they say, well, she was Irish. Why would her diary be written in Hungarian? We don't know. So Brother Thornley, who's like the society man, says, I belong to a secret society club called the Hellfire Club, which was a real thing, but is very reminiscent of the secret society vampire club that we read about in our first book club read. Yes, O'Keefe is a funny name. It's spelled O'Keefe, but according to the audiobook, it is O'Keefe. That is how it is pronounced. O'Keefe. So they go to the Hellfire Club, to secret society where nobody has an identity and they have to be snuck in. And they go to meet Thornley's friend, who's this like spy assassin with like, he's like Hungarian James Bond, basically. His name is Vambry. And they go and meet Vambry, and Vambry's like, before we can trust each other, we must tell each other one dark secret that we'll each take to our grave. So then you have like 10 pages dedicated to their dark secrets. And then Vambry says, okay, I'm Hungarian, so I can read this diary for you. And they're like, why would she write in Hungarian? I'm pretty sure she was Irish. She was definitely Irish. Well, maybe she just didn't want anyone else to be able to read it. It seems very contrived. Hey, the X-Men took Hellfire Club from the actual Hellfire Club. X-Men did not invent the Hellfire Club. So Vambry starts out as this really badass assassin who has prior knowledge of vampires. He's our like token wise mentor character who comes in and knows all about the vampires and can answer all their questions. He reads the Hungarian diary. And the Hungarian diary is the legend of the Derek Dew. And the Derek Dew is an Irish folklore legend of a revenant woman who comes back from the grave and seeks revenge. And in it turns out it's Ellen's backstory, even though it's written in third person. She wrote about herself in third person for some reason. That she was like the most beautiful girl in town, and she had this boyfriend that she wanted to marry, but her husband or her father wouldn't let her marry him. Instead, he married her off to the richest guy in town, who was like an earl or something. And this earl is like a total sadist, and he locks her up in the castle tower where he just like, does sadist stuff to her, like cuts her and makes her bleed for fun. And she just wastes away in this tower, and she waits a year for her boyfriend to come rescue her. And then he never does. So she refuses to eat until she's like skinny enough to slip through those little skinny castle like turret windows. And then she jumps to her death. But because she committed suicide, she comes back from the dead as a vampire, because that's a vampire lore thing, that if you commit suicide, you come back from the dead. So when she comes back from the dead, she seeks her bloody revenge. She's like Rosalie from Twilight, right? She kills all the servants who locked her up. She takes forever to just like kill and destroy her husband. And then she goes after her father because her father sold her into this, right? And she taunts her father. He doesn't invite her in, so she doesn't get in. So she spends a month taunting him until he starves to death as well. And then she finds out that the reason her father was so awful to her was because her mother died in childbirth and he resented the baby for killing the mother. And then she kind of feels bad. So then she goes off to find her boyfriend. And she's like, I feel bad for like all this revenge I've been wreaking. And I never was bad before. Now I'm a good person. And the boyfriend's like, shh, it's okay. And then he stakes her, but he doesn't do it right. So he stakes her and he buries her. And he buries her in the way that a vampire's not supposed to be able to come back, by putting rocks on the grave and putting a white rose on the grave. So then we find out, that's where the story ends for now. But we find out later that Dracula came along. The real Dracula, the actual Dracula, came along and brought her back from the death. Because apparently he was lonely and he wanted a girlfriend, and he picked her, and he's like, hey, this vampire exists. I want her to be my wife. So he brings her back from the dead, because he can, because she didn't get staked right, and puts her in his Dracula's castle in Transylvania. He's like, you will be my wife. I've decided I'm going to call you the Countess Dollinger von Gratz. That's your new name now. And she's like, okay. And he's like, you're going to be my wife. And she says, no, I want to go find my boyfriend. It's only been 3 years. He's still alive out there. Please let me go find him. And Dracula's like, no, you're mine now. You're mine. And he keeps her as a prisoner, and he keeps her there for hundreds of years. And she's just like miserable for a while. No, not hundreds of years. So first she's miserable for a while. He keeps her there for a year. And then he goes and he gets her boyfriend, and he brings her boyfriend back. And he's like, you know what I'm going to do to you? Just so you'll get and stay here with me. No, she's not one of Dracula's brides. She's like specialer than the brides. And he brings a boyfriend back, and he's like, okay, this is the guy you want? All right, fine. And he turns a boyfriend into a vampire, and then he draws and quarters the boyfriend. So he like ties him to a bunch of horses and sends them all in different directions, so he gets ripped up. So the boyfriend, his arms ripped off, his torso's ripped off, his head's ripped off, and then he pulls the heart out of the boyfriend. But he's still alive because he's a vampire now, so he's living in this horrible pain. And then Dracula buries each part of him in a different cemetery around Europe, but only in like unconsecrated cemeteries. So we find out that the mystery the kids were trying to solve when they were trying to figure out what Ellen, the nanny, was up to, was she was going around to all the different cemeteries and trying to find all the body parts of her boyfriend to put him back together. And that's what she's been doing, because she was with Dracula for hundreds of years after that, until she escaped in the 1840s, went off to be a nanny in disguise while she was hunting body parts. But ever since her revenge was over, she's been a good person. Like, the revenge was her one time being bad. She killed people. Now she refuses to kill people. She only drinks animal blood. She's not like the other vampires. And the guy who was accused of murdering his whole family, it was really Dracula who came and murdered his family because he was trying to get after Ellen. So he murdered this guy's family because it turns out this guy was a descendant, like a great-grandnephew of her boyfriend. So he murdered that family. So she managed to save the father and one of his daughters, and she turned them into vampires. So there's a little girl vampire too. And we think that they're evil and they're going around killing people, but it turns out, no, they're good vampires too. They have never killed a person. They've only drunk animal blood. They're good people. Even though we're led to believe they're supposed to be scary, but no, it turns out they're actually nice. So the Stoker siblings end up finding her and reconnecting with her and deciding that all we really have to do is stop Dracula. And they keep calling him Dracul in this, not Dracula. I think because the authors just wanted to set him apart. He is a Dracul, like he's of the family Dracul. Like there's a bunch of Draculs in history, right? Dracul was a popular name, and Dracula just means son of Dracul. So he is a Dracul. And the reason why he's a vampire is because in oldie times, ancient times, like way before Vlad the Impaler, the Draculs apparently would send their kids off to this like occult school. And at the occult school, they would learn the occult arts. They would learn magic. They would learn how to do all these magical vampire things, and then go off and be magical people like sorcerers. Yeah, evil Hogwarts, exactly. However, 1 in every 10 kids got taken by the devil and turned into a vampire. So Dracula was one of those 1 in 10s. So that's why he's a vampire. where the other Draculs weren't. So they call him Dracul all the way through the novel. Even though they know he's Dracula and they acknowledge he's Dracula, they still call him Dracul. I think this novel just did it to set itself apart from the original so it wouldn't seem silly, like they're trying to make it seem more serious. Talking so fast, I get thirsty. I need my Angry Orchard. This video is not sponsored by Angry Orchard. I just like it. And it was in the fridge at Grandma's house, so it's mine now. Yeah, they want it to be special. So now they have to stop Dracul because Thornley's wife, Emily, is turning into a vampire. And the only way they can save her is if they really stop Dracul. This is my arm workout for the day. So Ellen still wants to put her boyfriend back together. She's got every piece except the heart now. So she still wants to put her boyfriend back together, and they want to stop Dracul to save Emily. So they start working together. Ellen and her 2 vampire friends that she made, Patrick O'Keefe and Maggie O'Keefe, and she's got the body part box of Declan O'Keefe, and then the Stoker siblings and Vanbury. They all team up, so it's a very Dracula band of heroes situation going on. And they go off to Munich. Do you remember when we talked about Dracula's Guest? I talked about it in one of my videos. I did a whole video on it, and I read you the entire Dracula's Guest. So if you have watched my video, then you know all about Dracula's Guest, which takes place in Munich. For those of you who haven't, I'll sum up. Jonathan Harker is on his way to Dracula's Castle in Transylvania and stops in Munich and decides to go like sightseeing, and he finds this village of the dead. It's a village that was completely wiped out by plague. And he wants to go see it because he's like, you know, a creepy little morbid guy like me. So he wants to go see the village of the dead. And the carriage driver's like, I'm not going, you have to walk. So he walks there, he gets caught in a storm, he almost dies. He's in the graveyard, there's wolves coming, lightning striking, and he sees a grave of the Countess Dollinger von Gratz. And in it, he sees a woman who looks practically alive, and then lightning strikes the tomb, and she screams, and he escapes, and a wolf saves his life, and the story ends with him finding out that the reason he got rescued is because Dracula himself sent a telegram telling the innkeeper to go rescue him, which is so creepy. And this was originally from an early draft of Dracula that was supposed to be part of Dracula that got cut before it was in Dracula. So this book is basing itself off that, and as if that was real and actually happened. So the Countess Dollinger von Gratz is Ellen before she assumed her nanny identity. Even though she wasn't really a countess, it was just a random name that Dracula decided to give her, which seems really contrived in order to make it tie into Dracula's Guest. In Dracula's Guest, it was Harker. That's how it was originally written. Like, you can headcanon it to be someone else if you want to make it fit, but no, it is Harker. Sorry, pardon me. It's so dusty in here. So they go back to the same village that's in Dracula's Guest. They go to the village of the dead, but we find out that the reason it's the village of the dead is because Dracula turned every single person in that village into vampires. They're all sleeping there. They're all ready to get up and attack. That's where the heart is buried, so they have to get the heart to put the boyfriend back together. And of course, Dracula's there, and he's got Emily, who's his new vampire bride now, and she's just acting like very stereotypical, crazy, giggly vampire, like insane person, like saying nursery rhymes and stuff. Very cliche. They get there, they're stuck in before all this, before they get to that part, they go to Whitby because that's where the boyfriend's body parts are, and they have to collect it. And Bram has to spend a night guarding the body parts, and the entire novel is interspersed with scenes from that night he spends, which are very gothic, very creepy. It's all the creepy ways that Dracula is messing with his head. And those chapters are all written in present tense. And you find out about 7/8 through the book that happened and finished, and he got away just fine. And I really thought that those chapters that were interspersed were going to wind up being the climax. But after that, we have a whole different climax where they go to this village, right? And then there's a standoff with a bunch of cowboys Yet they're not cowboys. They're the Hungarian, Transylvanian servants. I don't know why they're dressed like cowboys, but they're the Transylvanian nomadic people that Dracula hires to be his servants. And they're there and they get killed. They come back as vampires. And then the entire village of vampires rises up. And then there's like a showdown and a standoff. And they manage to put the boyfriend's heart back in, but they realize that Dracula set them up. And Dracula says, the only reason you're here is because I allowed you to be here, because I wanted you to be here. And he's interested in Bram, especially because Bram has Ellen's blood in him, which is why he's been able to survive this long. And he wants Ellen back. And Ellen's like, no, I want my boyfriend. You can never have me back. And he says, the only way you're going to get out of here and your boyfriend's going to survive is if I get you back. So she can bring her boyfriend back to life, but she'll lose him anyway because she has to go back to Dracula. So they wind up coming to this understanding that he's going to bury her alive or undead in the tomb of the Countess Dollinger von Gratz, which he's already set up and like carved into the stone. So the book ends with her going with him, and she takes Bram with her just to like, so he can witness it, I guess. Dracula puts her in this tomb. He puts a lightning rod through her. So every time lightning strikes, she gets electrocuted and she's like tortured forever. And he's like, that's it. I'm satisfied. Bye. And Declan O'Queef gets to come back to life. But Patrick O'Queef dies because he's trying to defend them. So now little Maggie O'Queef, the 6-year-old vampire who's just there for some reason, she has a new daddy now. And the Stoker siblings all survive and go on to live their lives because in real life, they went on to live their lives. Vanbury, who's been there the whole time, and his whole deal the whole time is, we shouldn't work with these vampires. They're going to turn against us and use us. They brought us here to be blood bags. We should kill them all. And the Stoker siblings being like, no, I trust them. And then him turning out to be wrong. He's pretty useless. Like after he's given them the information about what vampires are, he's pretty useless. Dracula just goes on his merry way after he's punished Ellen. He gives Emily back to Thornley. But then you find out that Emily's still a vampire because they didn't kill Dracula, right? And Ellen tells Bram, you can't ever come back and rescue me from this grave until Dracula's dead. Otherwise, he'll just come and kill you all. Bram's like, he waits 20 years now. So now he's like 40 years old. And Mina Harker shows up on his doorstep and she's like, you should read all these documents I put together about our adventure with Dracula. But it's everything up until right before the end of Dracula where they went and killed him, right? And spoilers, Dracula ends with Dracula dying. Like Quincy kills him and then Quincy dies. So the end of this book is Bram being like, finally, I will go kill Dracula. And then ostensibly, if he goes and kills Dracula, then he can go free Ellen, and then Emily's curse will be lifted. Or no, wait, Emily can't be saved because she tasted human blood. So she's a vampire forever. So Thornley locks her up in an insane asylum because he's a madhouse doctor already anyway. And it's very sad. And they like hold hands through the bars. It's very sad. Because in real life, Thornley's wife, Emily, was institutionalized. And nobody knows why, because her husband institutionalized her himself as the director of the madhouse. So that's another thing that's from real life that they worked into this book. Yeah, I don't know why Mina gave him the documents before they killed Dracula, but the idea is that Bram then goes and helps her kill Dracula. Where should I put this here? There. Beautiful. So no, she was in isolation, okay? She wasn't with the other patients. She was in like a padded cell by herself. So some really cool things about this book was the way it tried to be different from Dracula. Excuse me, need some water. So instead of turning into a bunch of rats, Dracula turns into a bunch of bees, and it's creepy and scary. There's a lot of cockroaches. They turn into cockroaches. Dracula can turn into anything he wants, by the way. I don't know why Emily can't turn into mist. Maybe because they keep a rose there. Oh, so yeah, the thing about the roses is that the rose will nullify the vampire's power. So he does keep a rose in front of her cell. So that's probably why she can't turn into mist and escape the cell. The scene where he turns into bees is creepy. The early scene with the kids sort of tracking Ellen and trying to find out what her deal is. They go into this bog. There's a bog scene where she's like in this white nightdress and she descends into the bog and then she doesn't come up. And they're like, did she drown? What's she doing down there? And they're watching it and then they get attacked by dragonflies. It's very scary. And then they see a hand come up out of the bog and like grab a dragonfly out of the air. And, you know, you think eat it. But you find out it's one of the disembodied hands of Declan O'Keefe that came up. That was very scary. Yeah, for the most part, I really enjoyed the book. It was very creepy and gothic. It was well written. There was nothing that I disliked about it until the end. Like the end is where it kind of fell apart for me. It wasn't bad. I would still recommend this book. I did have complaints about the ending. And I think my problems with the end have to do with the fact that it was trying to present itself as real. You know, like a true, like this is what really happened in Stoker's real life. And it was trying to present itself as completely connected to Dracula's guest. So Ellen being the driving force of this story, the driving, like pushing all the plot forward, and then at the end just giving up and going into this grave, which happens to be there for her just so it can tie neatly back into Dracula's guest. I thought that hampered it a lot more than helped it. In the original draft of Dracula, before Bram Stoker fixed it up for English publication, he had Dracula have this past love, which was the Countess Dollinger von Gratz. And we see a portrait of her in Dracula's house. And this is available in the Icelandic version of Dracula, which was based on an earlier draft called Powers of Darkness. So this book is acting as if that Powers of Darkness is the real truth, not the version we get from England. So this Countess Dollinger von Gratz, we knew she was a love interest of Dracula. And there's so much you could have done with that. But the way this book did it was Dracula dug her up out of the ground, not having known her at all, just because she existed, was a vampire who existed that he could get. And he decided, you're going to be my wife now, and you're going to live in my castle. And she not be into it at all. And for her to spend the entire time fighting and trying to escape, and then get out eventually, and there's not an actual love affair there at all. It's just Dracula being like, you're mine now. Oh, you want to leave? That makes me mad. Now I'm going to punish you. I felt like there could have been a lot more done with that if you're going to focus on this being like an actual love interest character. Because they were trying to make Ellen be so good. Like, yeah, she goes on her revenge rampage, but then she's really sad about it, and she's good the entire rest of the time. And I thought that hampered it too. Forgive me, it's so dusty in here. I just keep coughing almost. I need more water. I will be right back. So also the fact that none of the Stoker siblings died in real life, and they wanted to honor that, made me think that there was no suspense in knowing if they would survive the story. Like, they'd go through this whole contrived framing device of having these present tense moments for the climax. So the climax is entirely in present tense, not letters or diary entries. So you're like, oh, maybe one of them won't survive because they're not writing in hindsight. And I thought that's what it was going to be. But, you know, obviously they didn't die in real life, and they had to stick with that. So there was also a Breaking Dawn fake out. You know how the entire climax of Breaking Dawn Part 2, the movie, not the book, was a vision in Alice's head of how everyone dies and gets destroyed, and then they reveal it's a vision afterwards, and everyone's so upset. They did the exact same thing in this book. So Bram gets touched by the vampire that Dracul can control and gets a vision that the vampires they were trusting turn on them and kill them all. And he was like, oh no, Vambery was right. And they're like, no, it was just an illusion. Everything is fine. It was the exact same Breaking Dawn Part 2 fake out. And it just, having it be forced to be the same as real life, be forced to be the same as Dracula's guest, held it back, I think. And trying to be forced to have Ellen just be so good. Like, someone called her morally gray. Yeah, all vampires are morally gray because, you know, they're blood-sucking creatures of the night. But she was such a good guy. She, like, only ate animals. She cared about her children so much. She just cared about the children. Everything was for her children or for her boyfriend. Nothing was for her. She completely gave up her life to others. That disappointed me. I don't want to say too many negative things about this book because I did like it. I liked it so much more than Dracula the Undead, which was a different author. Of course, Dacre Stoker consulted on both books, but the author himself was different. I did like J.D. Barker's writing. Someone in the book club on Discord mentioned that they didn't think the distinction between the voices of all the different point of view characters was enough, and I agree with that. I did think that the voices could be more distinct as far as like writing voice, right? Which is how the turns of phrase that characters use, the way they describe things, the way they react to things. It did sound like all the Stoker siblings had a very similar way of speaking. Well, see, Emily really was institutionalized. So maybe they were trying to do justice by that, by saying, oh, it was because she was a vampire, not because she was actually mentally unwell, or because her husband was like, hysterical woman must be locked up. And, you know, Victorian men didn't treat their wives very well. She could have been perfectly fine, not mentally unwell at all. I did think the women were written pretty well. When it comes to, you know, the way men write women, there's a lot of, you know, memes about how bad it can be. Like, these were good women. They weren't trying too hard to be like, oh, look how cool these women are. See how strong they are, which is one of the problems I had with Dracula the Undead, how badly the women were written. But in this, they did feel like real people. One of the things that I was disappointed by was so the Stoker siblings, as real people, had real personalities that affected their lives. It affected the way they handled things, the way they did things. Bram really wanted to go into theater. He was obsessed with theater. But his parents didn't like it. They didn't think that was cool. They were like, no, get a normal job, be a normal person. And they mentioned that in this because they wanted to include those biographical tidbits of Bram. But then that passion for theater never wound up tying into the plot at all. He never used any of his connections from the theater. Nothing about Bram's real life wound up affecting how he reacted to this vampire problem. He could have been like any cookie cutter character when it came to it. And they spent all the time setting that up because it was real, but didn't use it. So it's the sort of thing that you could have cut out of this book without losing anything, instead of making more of it and using it. Matilda, his sister, her one character trait was that she was an artist, but also like brilliant. So her smarts were like her one character trait. And she did do art things, but her art didn't wind up saving the day. And like Thornley's medical expertise didn't wind up solving a problem. Like, nothing about what was established with their characters wound up solving the problem, because it felt like the vampire stuff was really just happening to them. And Ellen was the only one that was actually driving anything forward and doing anything. She was the only really developed character. And I think it was because the authors didn't want to develop real people so much more. Like, Ellen was a real person, but there's much less known about her because she was, you know, just a nanny, as opposed to the Stoker siblings, which the Stoker family estate knows a lot about. So I think they were too careful, or maybe just felt tied back by that, and it made it much more difficult to have these characters be people that you could really engage with in the way that they affected the plot. Because, you know, when vampires are attacking you, the plot is happening to you, but things the characters do really need to drive it. I would have liked more of that. But as a Gothic novel, as a vampire book club read, it's definitely one of the best ones we've read. This one and The Quick are probably my two favorites so far. We've been reading a bunch of sort of disappointing duds in between. Seeing Through the Eyes of Children. All right, I'm going to try to look at some of your questions in the chat. If I missed something that you really want me to see, ask it again. And we're going to talk more about this book a little bit more. And then I will tell you what we're reading next and move on to those things. Oh, I'm sorry my sound is choppy. I'm in a very different setup than I usually am. Russell says, I didn't like that the things present Bram dealt with in the tower scene changed as the book went on. Like, why would Dracul be talking as Ellen when it was set right after the reveal that Ellen's good? Yeah, so Dracul gave the voices of a bunch of people Bram loved to try to get him to crack. And so why would Bram fall for that? It was a little strange. One of the downsides of writing a story that's tied to real people, but also tied to pre-existing works, like not only was it trying to stay true to Dracula, it's trying to stay true to Dracula's guest. So they were like, how do we get it so that Ellen is also the Countess and also has a grave with this date on it? They're like, why is the date 1801 on your grave? What does that date mean? She's like, oh, that was the date I decided I was going to try to escape. It took me 40 more years, but that was the date I decided it. So that's why he put 1801 on my grave. And why would he even like construct a grave and make it there for her? I think that things were kind of dropped with Thornley, like him fearing his job was in trouble because he would be accused of murder. Yeah, that was a good point that did get dropped. And the thing about Thornley is he sees Dracul turn into a swarm of bees. He sees his wife clearly turning into a vampire. And then 2 chapters later, he's like, what is all this talk of monsters? Pshaw, this is preposterous. I'm not going to believe that. We're supposed to believe that, you know, this is real. And then Vanbury just constantly being like, they're going to betray us. We should just kill them all. Like, he just said the same thing over and over again. And that was his entire character trait the entire time after. Henry Irving was mentioned in like the epilogue, I think, because I think this was set before Dracula knew Henry Irving. Yeah, Dracula was very empty in this book. Flat and paper-thin villain. Why did he want Ellen so bad? Why did he, like, put all his eggs in Ellen's basket? I don't know. Oh, and it's revealed in the author's note at the end that since this is ostensibly based on the fact that Bram Stoker said Dracula was real, well, then if Dracula was real, how would it work? So Bram Stoker says that he changed the names of identities, and Vanbury was a real person as well. He was a pal at like some society club they were all part of. And it's highly suspected that Bram Stoker based Van Helsing on Vanbury. So if Bram Stoker changed the names of people, then Van Helsing was Vanbury all along. So we find out at the end when he gets a manuscript from Mina Harker, and that she's been in contact with a friend of his, we know that it's Van Helsing, it's Vanbury. Vanbury was Van Helsing all along, except like the sexy 35-year-old version before he got older and became the Van Helsing that we know in Dracula. Which I don't get how being a Hungarian James Bond spy ties into being an anatomist doctor who deals with the occult, like in a medical school like Van Helsing is, but... Yeah, Dracula, his powers were creepy. His vampire attributes were creepy. The descriptions were really good, but his motivations were weak. His character as a character, where I felt like there could have been so much more done with that. Yeah, they say Van Helsing mentions Vanbury as like Bram putting in like a he aside thing, but no, it was the idea of this book is that Van Helsing was Vanbury all along. Yeah, Ellen should have just been the Derek Dew or the Countess Dolgen, not both. I agree. Trying to tie those two together was just weird, and it made the climax very weak. Yeah, Ellen did tell them the story of the Derek Dew as a spooky bedtime story, but as we learned from Matilda, Bram never stayed awake to hear the ending of that story. So Bram didn't know the way the story went, only Matilda knew, though why she didn't ever mention it along the way is weird. And the way Matilda's sections were done is, I think they were just trying to be like, what's different? We already have like 3 diaries going. We need something that's different than a diary, huh? So instead of writing a diary, Matilda is like writing letters to Ellen that she'll never send. So they're all written in like second person. So that was a choice. The audiobook did it very well. They had different voice actors for every single different point of view. That was fun. If you look at the audiobook cast, it has like 7 people on it. Happy birthday, dear Alta Trekkie. We are the same age. You could enjoy this book if you weren't familiar with Dracula, Starfire 1. You can enjoy it as just a very gothic, very spooky, ambient book about vampires. But it would feel very generic. Like if it was your first vampire book, it would be great. But if you've read a lot of other vampires, but not Dracula for some reason, it might seem very cliche to you. But if you're familiar with Dracula, those cliches don't really matter because you're looking for the connections, the Easter eggs, the way it all ties together, so it can engage you more. Was Maggie meant to be evil at some point? Maggie was the 6-year-old girl vampire. For reasons, there was one. You're supposed to think she's evil. You're supposed to think she killed the coachman, but you find out later, no, she's never even tasted human blood. So ideally, if Dracula dies, then Maggie will be set free. I definitely recommend this book. It is not perfect, but few books are. But I do recommend it, and I think you should check it out just for the sake of its gothicness, if nothing else, because finding like a truly gothic novel in these days that are vampires, it's like decent enough, that's really good, it's worth it. Oh, thank you, Lindy Cal, for the $4.99. You are awesome. Thank you so much. The blonde vampire in the final version of Dracula is confirmed to be the Countess Dolgen in a deleted draft of Dracula typescript. Not confirmed, it's suspected, because there is a blonde vampire who's living in Dracula's castle that Jonathan Harker has a much more elaborate, detailed affair with in the early version of Dracula, the Powers of Darkness version. And that's thought to be the Countess. But in the version of Dracula we read that has the 3 vampire brides, those brides are, one of them is blonde, so it's like, is it supposed to be the same or just an homage to her? There's absolutely nothing to link that blonde character to the other one. And according to this, if this is supposed to be real, as if Dracula was supposed to be real, Ellen, the Countess, was still buried in that crypt and therefore couldn't possibly be at Dracula's castle by the time Jonathan gets there. Powers of Darkness is great. Get Powers of Darkness just to read like the foreword. And Dacre Stoker contributed to that as well. I've actually met Dacre Stoker. He was at a convention that I went to about a year ago, last summer. And he told me some cool things about his writing process and how he got hooked up with these guys and how he contributes to these books, because he doesn't consider himself a writer much. He is a researcher and he is a fact guy, and he gives the ideas and just works hand in hand with these authors that he's teamed up with. Yeah, all the murders they think Ellen and Maggie did all turned out to, it was Dracula all along, or Dracul, excuse me. It's not until the very end that Bram's like, oh yeah, I should have been calling him Dracula all along. That would have been more correct. But of course, this draft didn't get changed. Yeah, it turns out Dracula ate the coachman, even though we thought it was Maggie. Because, we had to have that scary scene with Maggie where she seemed threatening, where she was like, I will destroy you, ha ha ha. Because why was she being mean? I don't know. Just to have a scary scene when later on we find out, oh no, she was good all along. She was just trolling you. So like these kind of threats that wind up going nowhere. It just I feel like it's the best book that it could have been, but there is certain essential things to the ideas of this book that held it back that I think were a little disappointing. I don't think it should have been different to make that better. I just think that based on what they were going for, this is what it was. I think when Mina comes to see Bram, that is meant to be just before they go off to kill Dracula, because Bram knows where Dracula's castle is. Ellen left him a note that told him exactly where it was. And when Mina drops off the manuscript, he goes and he gets on a train to go kill Dracula. So either Mina and her band of heroes never went to kill Dracula, Bram did it himself, and then when he wrote Dracula, he just wrote a different fictional ending for that, or he teamed up with them and went together and he was there and just didn't write himself into the book. If there was an epilogue with Vampire Bram Stoker in the modern day, that's like how Abraham Van Helsing, Vampire Hunter, ends. Dracul/Dracula does not die in this book. It ends with Bram going off to kill him. And then we understand that he's going off to be part of the original Dracula, which if you've read, ends with Dracula dying. And then hopefully that means Ellen gets free. And I guess Maggie would turn back human again. Oh, thank you, Angie Kelly, for the $5. Thank you so much. There is absolutely no suggestion in this novel that Bram Stoker was gay or bisexual at all, which would have been great. I don't know if Dacre Stoker believes his ancestor was queer, but it is a very common Stoker scholarly opinion that Bram Stoker was queer in some way. He was married to a woman, so maybe he was bi, or maybe he was gay and he just, married a woman because that's what you did in those days. But there's nothing about that in this book. He had 0 romances in this book at all. Either no flirtations, nothing. He was just with his siblings the entire time. The only romance in this book was between Dracul and Ellen, and between Thornley and his insane wife, Emily. The lady in the asylum stays an asylum vampire forever. Shouldn't that be an epilogue? It was an epilogue. Well, see, she had tasted human blood, so that means if Dracula dies, she still stays a vampire. If she had never tasted human blood, she would have turned back human. But we know in real life, she lived till the age of 60. So maybe at the age of 60, even though she didn't age because she's immortal and young forever, they ended her vampire life somehow. Or maybe they just faked her death. What would I have done differently with this book? I would have made Dracula's connection to Ellen a lot more complex and deep. I wouldn't have had him just be like, you random vampire lady, Derek, do I choose you to be my new wife? And I'm going to care a lot about that. I would have given them something more for that to matter. I would have had her spend more time in his castle dealing with him, living with him. As someone in my book club on Discord said, that she had all these like attributes of manipulation and like wiles, and if she had used those to try to escape him instead of just being like, I refuse to be here, and like being like pushy that way, that would have been more interesting. Like if they had made that more of like a relationship, so he was less just like the evil vampire I must escape. He was just like, no, it's actually my ex I must escape. Like actually play into that more. I would have used more of Bram's personality in how he fits into the story, because Bram could have been replaced with absolutely anyone. He was not really a person in this at all. Like his everything that motivated his choices didn't seem to matter. The fact that he had been ill and then got healthy, I would have had that play more into every single decision he made. His love of theater, which they took so much time to mention, I would have had that play more into how he solved his problems, either like through people he know or skills he learned or something. There was no mention of Bram's involvement with politics in the novel. The rules of vampires in this book is if the vampire is drinking from a person, they're gradually going to turn into a vampire. If they get drunk from enough. If that person then drinks human blood, they stay a vampire forever. But if they don't, then if the vampire who turned them dies, and they get to turn back human again. Which is how Mina survives in Dracula, right? Like Mina was starting to turn into a vampire in Dracula, but because they killed Dracula, Mina turns back normal again. Were there any creepy scenes that would make you jump scare in the book? Yes, the book was very scary with very creepy scenes, especially if you're listening to the audiobook during an epic thunderstorm while driving on the road for 13 hours like I was. Some very scary scenes. So if you scare easily, this book might be too scary for you. Yeah, Bram got turned into like a hemi-demi semi-vampire, to quote Dance of the Vampires, a fantastic musical. So Ellen drank his blood and gave Bram her own blood. And that gave Bram a lot of vampire powers. He could like see in the dark. He never got sick. He could heal really fast. He was very strong. But he didn't turn into a vampire at all in any way, like Emily did. Like, why? We don't know. He was just special. And that made Dracula very interested in Bram. It's part of why Dracula was like, I've let you live for reasons, which I will not explain. It's because I have need of you, which he never does anything with. And then he lets him go, and we're like, okay, bye, Dracula. Yeah. Yeah, the bell scene in the morgue was really good and really scary. I did give it 5 stars on Goodreads because I only give a book 5 stars or no stars now. Like, I've gotten to the point in my reading and writing career that if I'm not going to give a book 5 stars, I just don't give it any stars, because when you're an author and people are giving you stars, it like hurts your feelings to get lower stars. And I don't want to be that guy. That's fine. Plenty of other people will give it accurate stars. But I did like this book and I would recommend it. And of the book club books, it's probably the only one I've given 5 stars to. And I did it not because it was perfect, but because it had enough in it that I was like, yes, this is awesome. This is my kind of book. Definitely my kind of book. Yes, Bram should have been Dracula's boyfriend. I would read that. Oh, good, Nate Dogs. I'm glad I've sold you on the book. I've spoiled so much of it for you, but it's still a very ambient, entertaining read, especially on Audible. Yeah, if being the special drew Dracul to Bram, he's so interested in Bram, but they don't establish a real dynamic with it at all. Like, he is interested in Bram, and that's part of why he brings Bram out to show him what he does to Ellen at the end. But why? Where does it go? He's like, I have need of you. You're special to me. I want to do something with you. And then nothing happens. And are we to believe that it comes into when Bram writes Dracula later? We don't know, because it's not in the book. And anything that happens after this book, we're supposed to believe is just Dracula. But the Powers of Darkness version of Dracula, because supposedly that's the real version. And the version of Dracula that we read in English wasn't the real version. It was Bram Stoker having to edit his work heavily, because Dracula was a true story, you see, and Powers of Darkness is a true story, but he had to change too much for the English version. Yeah, the book definitely could have been gayer. See, the Quick was gay. I like that about the Quick. Yeah, see, Bram did have vampire urges. He did want to crawl into the wormy dirt. He did not have urges to, like, bite people and suck their blood, though, except Ellen's, of course, because it was keeping him alive. There's no connection between, like, the interview with the vampire trope of Stoker, like, of Dracula being like, go tell my story, I want to be known. There's nothing that implies Dracula wants that, or that he even thinks Bram will publish his work about him. Like, that would have been interesting if Dracula said, here's my motivation, but we never get his motivation at all. Does this book feature a sympathetic vampire? Yes, Ellen is sympathetic. Maggie is essentially sympathetic. Emily is sympathetic. Patrick O'Keefe and Declan O'Keefe are sympathetic. Everyone except Dracul are sympathetic. Yeah, probably too much sympathetic, because all the good vampires are completely good, as it turns out. We spent the whole book thinking that they were bad, or maybe kind of morally ambiguous, like maybe they want to be good, but they have to give in to their vampire urges. No, they never even give in. Not even give in. Yeah, Dracula wanted Bram to be his servant because Bram meant so much to Ellen. He's like, why does Ellen care so much about you? Therefore, you will be mine, because I want what Ellen wants. But then he just lets Bram go. He's just, and it's gone. Oh, thank you, Victoria Stark, for 10 Canadian dollars. Joining this book has been one of my best decisions during quarantine so far. Just wondering, have you ever thought about doing a video/book club pick for the Gilda Stories by Joelle Gomez? I have not thought about that. I'm going to have to look that up. Everything that I've done for my book club has been books that I already own that I'm like, I really should read those books. Let's have a whole book club, read them with me. But I will add that to my list. Gilda Stories. Thank you for the recommendation. What are the vampires' metaphors for this time? Well, you know what was a big theme of this book was hunger and, thirst. So the whole beginning of the book just goes ham on the Irish potato famine, right? Everyone is so hungry, just so hungry. But Bram's family does this thing, even though they're not rich or anything, where they will take anyone in and give them food. They're just giving people, and they want to feed all the hungry people, feed all the hungry children. They think Patrick O'Keefe tried to kill his family because he couldn't feed them. He got beaten at work for trying to steal a loaf of bread. I mean, some grain. Just everything is about hunger. So I really thought that the vampires were going to be this metaphor for hunger, for starvation, for the desperation people go to during famines and like, you know, national crises. But they kind of fizzled out. And Dracul was not hungry at all. So there was like a real good chance in there for that to be there. Like maybe Ellen was hungry for revenge and then hungry for her love, but it's just like wanting things. Like I just want things. Yeah, that what Dracul meant as a vampire was, you know, patriarchal oppression, like he always does. An aristocrat taking advantage of lesser people to sate his needs. But what Ellen meant as a vampire was motherhood. So it wasn't very focused on thematic consistency. And I felt it could have been too, but that's not absolutely necessary. Like you can have a perfectly good vampire story without it having a consistent message. Like there are other reasons to have vampire stories. Have I seen Daria Cohen's vampire animations? Yes, and they are amazing. And if you haven't seen Daria Cohen's vampire animations, you should go watch them when this stream is over. Not right now. I've favorited them, so if you can like look at my favorites on YouTube, you can find them. But just look her up. They are amazing. Watch them all in order because there's like a through line plot. Oh, thank you, Angie Kelly, $5. What if Bram Stoker and Irving were an emotionally gay couple and Irving was a vampire? That would be so sweet. You should write that. They're both dead. It's public domain. I would read that. Though, by all accounts, Irving was kind of a jerk. But, you know, it would be an angsty relationship. A very angsty relationship, which, you know, is like my cup of tea. So how do I think Dracul would react to these stories told about him? I don't know. He'd probably be like, yes, my ego is stroked. Thank you. At least this mustache twirling version of him. I mean, Dracula in the original Dracula is like, I have loved more than you can ever realize. You make these assumptions about me that I am just evil, but I have feelings too. You know, he's a little deeper than this, which surprises me because this was trying so hard to be like, we're really going to pay that homage that a lot of people miss in their interpretations, and then did it in some ways, but not in others. Have I read Dracula Cha-Cha-Cha by Kim Newman? No, I have not. I own it. It is on my list, but I have not read it yet. Isn't that not the first in the series, though? Don't I have to read the other Kim Newman books before I get to that one? I would like to read them in order. I have them all, so I will. And I actually put one of them up for vote for the book club, because the way we choose books in our book club is by voting, and the club did not vote for Anno Dracula that time, but it'll come back around. We'll read them all eventually. Yeah, Dracula in the original Dracula was much more three-dimensional than this Dracula. Yeah, Dracula was very OP in this. They made it clear that Dracula can do absolutely anything he wants because he went to Vampire Hogwarts and just like got all the powers. And he could just do anything. Like anything they thought would defeat him, he's like, no. He still can't enter without being invited and that kind of stuff, but like he's impossible to kill, apparently. I know, I too want to go to Vampire Hogwarts. How do I enroll there? Well, the way you kill a vampire is you cut off their head, impale their heart, and then burn everything. Though I don't know why you have to do those two steps first, like because if you just burn everything, then you have to scatter the ashes to the four winds. Like I feel like that would be effective in itself, but maybe they're hard to like catch. I did like the bees. I liked it when he turned into bees. He reminded me of that Well, the Cards Against Humanity, like bees, or the Nicolas Cage, the bees. It was fun. I have not read Dr. Sleep by Stephen King. Well, you can't bury vampires in consecrated cemeteries. It's sacrilegious. I think they can't even enter consecrated place. Maybe that's why. Yeah, no one thought to look under the carriage. No one, and they realized that at the time. They're like, fools that we were. We didn't look under the carriage where he hid his coffin. Bees. Thoughts on Midnight Sun? I have acquired Midnight Sun. I ordered it and it came in the mail right before I had to leave for this trip. It's like this big though, so I didn't bring it with me. But I plan to read Midnight Sun. Maybe the book club will read it with me, though it is not our next book. Our next book, I will let you know as soon as we're done talking about this book, though we have been going for an hour and 15 minutes on Dracul by J.D. Barker and Dacre Stoker. Any last thoughts or feelings about this book that we really want to express, or any questions you have about it? Now's your chance. Oh, I miss you too, Ball. Yeah, the fact that it had 2 third acts, like the whole build up of the book is to Bram spending the night in this tower while all this creepy stuff keeps happening to him. There's like snakes, there's like gargoyles, there's like wolves, there's so many wolves. There weren't that many bats. Like I feel like they were trying to get away from the things that have already been done doing other things. So this time they did snakes, they did bees, there were cockroaches, tons of cockroaches everywhere, worms. Paul is home. I mean, Paul is in the chat, but he's home. Yeah, so I thought this was all building up to this scene in this tower. No, that's just like the beginning of the third act. Then they have to go and do a whole separate climax. I don't know what the reasoning was behind that choice. I do know of one other fictionalized Bram Stoker book. It's called Stoker. I want to say the author is Calvin Cherry. It was actually released like a few months before this, so they were being written simultaneously. It is in no way connected to Dacre Stoker or the Stoker Estate, so it's purely fan fiction. I own it. The book club did not vote on it, but perhaps we'll read it sometime. Yeah, there were bats in the tower when they were going up the mystery tower with the mystery candles. Oh, and there's one point where Dracula puts out the St. Elmo's fire, the Will o' the Wisps, just because he does that in the book. So it's just like, poof, here's some Will o' the Wisps. Now they're gone. Like things that they tossed in to try to be like, he does that in Dracula. See, he's doing it here, which I appreciate it. But instead of doing anything with it, they just kind of sprinkle them on. Could have been more. But as a fan of Dracula, I appreciate the homages. We have already talked about the theory of Bram Stoker being a closeted gay or bi man. And I think it has merit, though maybe I'm just wishful thinking, because I sure would like that to be true. Yeah, McNally in Search for Dracula mentioned it, but McNally is also the one that said Bram Stoker specifically based Dracula off Vlad the Impaler. And as this book mentions, that's not true. It's never been believed to be true. However, when I met Dacre Stoker a year ago, which was a year after this book had been written, he said, we have found new evidence that maybe it was true. And we were all saying McNally was wrong all this time, that Vlad the Impaler wasn't Dracula all this time. Now, maybe he was, and he's going to tell me about it. He promised he'd tell me about it next time I see him. So as soon as I get that scoop, I will let you know. I don't know if the Stoker family has any say on the Bram Stoker Award. I'll have to ask. Yeah, we're shipping Dracula now. or Stoker, Dracul. Can't reach my book. Why did I put it so far away? Okay. Ah, got it. What does a vampire have to do before installing a new piece of software? Something with bytes. Make sure the computer has enough bytes. That's my guess. Just Andre, tell me the punchline to your joke. I'm waiting. Oh, sign up for Dracula. Har, har, har. I feel like this book probably couldn't have been done as well by anyone because all the personal information about the Stoker family was what Dacre Stoker contributed. Even though he wasn't writing the story, he was providing all the information that J.D. Barker really needed in order to write this. I don't think J.D. Barker could have written this story without that information. However, he could have written a story that would have been very inaccurate and perhaps better for being inaccurate because he wouldn't have been so tied to the details. However, the details are cool and I'm interested in the details, so valuable for what it is. The little girl vampire served no purpose besides being creepy. She was muscle, like she was there, but she didn't like save the day or do anything. She was just there to be creepy and to show how good Ellen was because she saved this little girl's life and took care of her. It's another like way for Ellen to be motherly. All right. So next time for Vampire Book Club, I decided that we've done a lot of like serious business books. So it's time for some vampire. I don't know if it's comedy, but vampire light. So the choice was My Favorite Fangs, which was vampires in Sound of Music. Wuthering Bites, which was Heathcliff is a vampire on the moors in Wuthering Heights. Or the winner, A Vampire Christmas Carol. And we're having Christmas in September. I didn't think people would vote for this book because it's not Christmas time. But no, that's what the people want. It was actually very close. It was almost a tie between this and Wuthering Bites. And if it had been a tie, I would have chosen Wuthering Bites just because it's not Christmas. But it wasn't a tie. This won by one vote. So next month we are reading A Vampire Christmas Carol. You have until the 13th to read this book. It's a short book, much shorter than our previous reads. Hopefully a light book. No, there's no audio book of this, so you do have to read it with your eyeballs, unfortunately, or do the ebook thing where the Kindle or whatever program you use reads it to you. My mother gave me this book. She got it used somewhere, and she got it from me because she knows I collect vampire books. But she read it first because she's a huge Dickens fan. My mother loves Dickens. She's like read all the Dickens 4 times each. And she really liked this book, which it's not something I would think of as like a mom book. But she really liked it. So if my mom liked it, it's good enough for me. And as a super Dickens fan, she liked it. So I'm hoping it's going to be pretty good. So we'll see. Vampire Christmas Carol by Sarah Gray. Ebenezer Scrooge, Vampire Slayer. That's the subtitle. Ebenezer Scrooge, Vampire Slayer. Are you excited? I am. She's also the author of Wuthering Bites, by the way. So, you know. When am I going to be making a spooky library room tour? Well, I did just make a new video about the new books in my vampire library. I've made many books about all my vampire library. Like, I've made those videos many times, but I just made a new video, which is on my Patreon. It's private now. I'll probably make it public later this week, and then you can all watch it. Do we know who's the vampire in this? Well, I know it's not Ebenezer Scrooge because he's the vampire slayer, so maybe it's like the ghosts of Christmas. Past, present, and future, maybe they're the vampires? I don't know. What vampires does Ebenezer Scrooge have to slay? And why is he a hero and not learning valuable life lessons? I hope he learns valuable life lessons through slaying vampires. Tiny Tim is the vampire. There you go. Now, I bet he has to save Tiny Tim from the vampire, because then he would look good. Slay the meaning of Christmas. Oh, yeah. It's not a vampire's Christmas Carol. That is a different book. Make sure you're getting a Vampire Christmas Carol. No, that's Vampire's Christmas Carol. The one with the steamy man chest. No, that's not it. Get A Vampire Christmas Carol by Sarah Gray. Make sure you're looking at the right author, because there's a different Christmas Carol, which is just like vampires having Christmas. It's not the same book. If I could adapt Dracula, I would make it even gayer than the original novel. Yes, make that homoerotic subtext just text. I would pay to see that. Like, is all the ways they've made like Dracula sexier over the years, they've never done anything with the group of hot young boys that are in it. They've never like gone for each other at all, especially since they've all got like this baggage and history and stuff. Like, why couldn't they all be bi? I mean, Quincy, Arthur, and Jack were all in love with Lucy, right? Like, really in love with her. Like, not just society is pressuring me to do it. So why couldn't the two that got rejected hook up? Did I finish the Daughters of Shadow and Blood trilogy? I did not. I read the first one and I have not read the next two. I have them, but I have not read them yet. I mean, people do have Mina and Lucy be gay in several versions, or at least Lucy is, right? Because she's the slutty one, and you know how bi women are, right? That's been done because female queerness is more palatable to American audiences than male queerness. It's a thing. You guys are great. I love you so much. We're coming up on an hour and a half. If you have any last thoughts or feelings about Dracul or Vampire Christmas Carol or vampire reviews in general, now's your chance. And you like this mug that I found at Grandma's house? Hey, look, it goes with our Christmas book. There we go. I don't know who Mommy is, because this certainly wasn't given to my grandma by her children, because my dad's 70 years old. So if you are not already part of the Vampire Book Club, join my Discord. The link is in the description. Actually, the link is not in the description. I will put that link in the description as soon as we're done here, though it is in the description of my other Vampire Book Club videos, so you can just go grab it from there if you want it right now. Join my Discord. You have to go through the process of like clicking the book icon to actually join the Vampire Book Club, because it is a private book club, though anyone is welcome to join. We read one book a month. I will usually choose 3 books from my vampire library that I already own, and we will vote among those 3 of what to read. Usually it's from the 13th to the 13th. We're doing a little late this month because I'm in this situation. And also it was my son Gray's birthday on the 13th. He turned 6. Can you believe it? And I am putting up a new video. It's already on my Patreon. It's been there for about a week now, but I'm going to make it public later this week. about my vampire library, all the new vampire books I got. I got a whole bunch of new vampire books. They're great. People send me vampire books all the time. My library just keeps getting bigger. If you want to send me vampire books, that's a thing you can do. Address is in the description. Only do it if you want to. A lot of people are like, I have all these old vampire books I'm throwing out. Do you want them? Yes, I will take care of vampire books. If you're like, does she already have this vampire book? I don't want to send her something she already has. There is also a list in a link in the description that has a list of every single vampire book I already own, except the new ones I just got. So you can check that list and see if I already own it. Or if you're like, what vampire books does she own? Because I too want them. It's a Amazon list. So you could actually like click on the book and then order it on Amazon. That is something you can do. I made it easy for you because people are like, I watch your videos and I have to keep rewinding it to like write down the names of all the books. Don't do that. I made it easy for you. I made a list. There's like over 300 in my library now. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to everyone who sent me super chats because you guys are awesome. You make this show happen. If you can't join my Patreon, just like leave me comments on my videos because that really helps. Always love it. Oh, thank you so much. You guys are all so sweet. You know, Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Bright is like one of those classic popular vampire books that I just don't have yet. I'll get it one of these days. I'm sure I'll find it in a used bookstore. That's where I get most of my vampire books, actually. I just like go to used bookstores and like see which ones they have and buy them all for like $0.25. I need to read Lost Souls. So thank you for joining my vampire book club and reading books with me during quarantine because we're all so, you know, caught inside. I gotta go back to cleaning this house now. Yeah, Grandma's house. All right. Until next time, come find me on Discord. I'm there every day. I read like everything. Even if I don't respond, I'm still like there. I'm reading it. Good night. Click the button.